Okay, good afternoon, everyone, or all of those of you who are here. We seem to be losing more and more people every day, so I'll have to think of something to do about that. Can't be their comparative advantage not to be here. So anyway, this slide you've actually seen before because this is the first two problem sets in the first exam by discussion section. So here's the next two problem sets as well as exam number 2. So if you compare these, again, a couple of things that kind of pop out. One is the problem set scores were on average a little bit higher, so I need to write harder problem sets, and the exam scores were significantly lower this go around than the first exam. But also notice that, at least for exam number 2, that the dispersion amongst both between the mean, which is the first number, and the median, which is the second number, they're all very close. And the differences across discussion sections is not all that wide either, actually closer than what we had on exam number 1. It is disappointing, of course, that the scores are that low. But it's also true that the standard deviations were bigger. So there were big moves to the high side around the mean and median, and also scores, unfortunately, that were well to the low side of that. This last column is the weighted average for the first 4 problem sets and both of the first 2 exams. So now a couple of things. This came up, I think, last time. The problem sets, if you had a 0 on a problem set because you didn't turn it in, that's 0. It's not included in the mean and medians, but it is included in the weighted average. So again, the weighted average is not just a simple weighted average of those means and medians. Once again, you'll notice that we're fairly close across discussion sections, and the means and medians are fairly close, which is what we like to see, what I like to see about consistency of grading across discussion sections as well as dispersions. Now, remember that you get to drop one of your problem sets, so it may be one of these, so things will be a little bit different. Also keep in mind that final course grades are determined by GSI sections. So you don't have to worry about if you're in ASRAT section with a 72 mean or a Liang section at 74. That's not going to make any difference between discussion sections because I assign letter grades by the discussion sections by GSIs. Needless to say, the further above the weighted average mean and medians you are, the better your grade's going to be. You got a question? Yes, they're all out of 100. I convert everything to a percentage. So the problem sets that only had 50 points were still just calculated as a percentage. Yes. Yes, ma'am. All 4 problem sets and 2 exams. So again, that may not be the problem sets that we're going to actually use at the end because we only use the top 5. Yes? No, it's stuck in my computer somewhere, but I don't know what it was. It was, I want to say 12, 14, something like that. In that 12, 15. I'll try and remember to look that up and let you know on Tuesday. No, that's exactly the question he asked. What was the standard deviation? And I don't remember off the top of my head. So obviously it varies between discussion sections. But now that you've reminded me, I'll be sure to look that up and either send you out an email or we'll talk about it on Tuesday. Yes? Right? Well, I'm looking at these scores, not this score, right? So I don't assign letter grades to the individual ones. I'm just assigning points over here. So what I'm going to be interested in at the end of the semester is the weighted average of your 5 highest problem sets and all 3 of your exams, and whatever that is. So this is the column that I'm interested in, and you should be interested in. You can calculate your weighted average and figure out where you are relative to that. Okay? Yes? I don't know. I don't know. So weighted averages the weighted average median, the second number, historically has been around a B. Okay. Anything else? Okay. Okay, today we want to start a discussion that will actually last for the next couple of lectures about international trade agreements. And we want to start today just by talking about why we have international trade agreements, what the advantage is, a very quick and brief history of international trade agreements in the 20th century, early 21st century, and then a discussion about what we refer to as preferential trading agreements. And one of the things that we'll see is that most trade agreements up until about the last 20 years now have actually been what we call multilateral agreements. And since the last 20 years, most of them have actually been preferential trading agreements. So we need to understand both the multilaterals as well as the preferential trading agreements. So remember that we've been talking about things like tariffs and import quotas and export subsidies and all these other types of trade policy instruments that governments put into place typically to protect an import competing industry or to support an export-oriented industry. And we can see that even though there are net losses in terms of national economic welfare by imposing those, there are benefits to the producing companies, regardless of whether you're an import competing firm or you're an exporter. And we talked earlier about how those who are receiving benefits from trade policy are typically much more politically organized and influential to try to secure those benefits and to sustain those benefits over time than are the losers, who are typically the consumers of the products. So whenever two countries come together to try to remove trade barriers and they enter into an agreement, now we've already seen that when you remove a trade barrier, you actually have an increase in national economic welfare. So when we come together to do that, we refer to that as an international trade agreement. When many countries are involved, then it's a multinational or multilateral trade agreement. All trade negotiations under the World Trade Organization's auspices are multilateral trade agreements. So they include all members of the WTO, which now exceeds something like 150 countries. So let's just take a situation about why we might want to think about having formal negotiations here. So let's take two large countries. And the emphasis here is on large, right? So these are going to be large countries. And we'll just assume for the sake of simplicity of this discussion that these two countries are symmetrical. That is, remember when we talked about symmetry earlier, that they have exactly the same effect on one another. We'll have the U.S. as the import country and China as the export country. And what we'll say then is, let's suppose for the moment that the U.S. puts on a tariff. And again, because the U.S. is a large country, it will also drive down the world price, which of course is China's export price. And if we were to calculate the welfare effects, we would want to look at area A, B, C, D, and E. Okay, so those would be the welfare effects that we would see on the U.S. Now if we thought about the change, though, that is occurring here, that tariff means that consumer surplus will go down by A, B, C, and D. Producers are better off, of course, and very well organized. And the government will receive tariff revenue of C plus E. So when we think about our net change, we end up with our production and consumption distortions and this little bit called E, which is positive, which is our terms of trade gain, our terms of trade gain. Now the question then becomes, is it possible for the terms of trade gain to be larger than the production and consumption distortions? And the answer to that question is yes, under certain circumstances. And the circumstances have to do with how big is the tariff. So notice that if we have no tariff at all, there are no terms of trade effect. If we have, and there's also no tariff revenue. If we have a prohibitive tariff, there will be a terms of trade effect, but there won't be any tariff revenue. So the terms of trade effect, actually, that E area disappears, right? So a prohibitive tariff is going to drop imports to absolutely zero. So as we raise the tariff rate as a large country and push down the world price, this area E here goes from zero before the tariff is imposed, and then it starts to get larger and larger before it starts to get smaller and smaller. So there's a point at which, if we could pick it right, where we would have the maximum terms of trade effect. And at that particular point, it can generally be shown, not universally, but generally be shown that terms of trade effect is greater than the consumption and production distortions. So what that means then is it's possible for this to have a positive value. And the tariff rate that generates that is sometimes referred to as the optimal tariff. Now it turns out that optimal tariff will actually be fairly small. Remember, the larger and larger the tariff is, the bigger and bigger the production and consumption distortions will be. So you want to keep those production and consumption distortions as small as you can relative to the size of your terms of trade gain. Okay. So now let's look at this from China's perspective. We can also look at the various areas that we have here. We're going to have more areas. Okay, so I want to label all those little areas in there. And now we can calculate the net change, consumer surplus, producer surplus, government revenue. And what we see for China is that consumers are better off by area A plus B, but Chinese producers are worse off by A, B, C, D, E. China did not impose a tariff, so there's no tariff revenue. So China's welfare clearly declines by C, D, and E. Again, we've got production and consumption distortions, and in this case, a terms of trade loss. So China is unambiguously worse off. The U.S. could be better off. Now, let's think about a trade game. Yes? Sure. I'm sorry, yes, the terms of trade loss is D, right? So here's their exports, and that's what's happened to the price. Yes? Is D what the producers have to pay? No, it's the lower price they receive for their product on the world market. So they're exporting at a lower price. The tariff will be, in some sense you could say, yes, it's the part of the tariff that they end up paying because they'd be getting a lower price for their product. But it's not a tax directly on the Chinese producers. The tax is being placed on American importers or consumers. It's just that part of that tax, remember tariff is just a tax, part of that tax is passed forward onto consumers of the product in the US, and part of that tax is being passed backwards onto producers in China. Mm-hmm. Well, remember, in the US's case, the importer's bringing it in at the lower world price. So the importer, the US importer, is buying it from China at a lower price. So the Chinese producers are worse off because of that. Now, the US importer brings it in at the low world price, sells it at the tariff-ridden price. But the difference between those is the size of the tariff. And that's the money that goes to the government. Okay? So let's think about a trade game. Very similar to what we did with strategic trade theory. What we want to look at is what would be where is the Nash equilibrium? What's the optimal choice for both the US and for China? So we're going to have either a tariff or no tariff. And the tariff that we're going to talk about is going to be that optimal tariff. So remember, in an optimal tariff, the terms of trade gain is bigger than the consumption and production distortions. So let's think about the US situation. If there is no tariff, there's no welfare gain in either country. Oops. Or loss. Now, if the US imposes the optimal tariff, notice that they end up with a small gain. where the terms of trade are offsetting the production and consumption distortions. China, by not having a tariff, is actually going to have a large loss. They have both production and consumption distortions as well as the terms of trade loss. Okay? Now remember, we said that, for simplicity of analysis, these two countries are symmetrical. So if this is the outcome, if the US has an optimal tariff and China has none, then we'll just flip it if China has the optimal tariff and the US has none. So in that case, China would have a small gain, and the US would have a large loss. Now, what happens if both countries put on a tariff? Now, they'll be on different goods, right? So from the US perspective, if we put on a tariff, then at least in the context of that product, we have a small gain, right? It's the same thing that we have up here. So we get a small gain there. But what happens if China puts on a tariff on a different product that they import from us? They also get a small gain. Again, just looking at it from a partial equilibrium analysis. So what's the optimal position for the US? So for the US, it's clearly we want to have a tariff. Whether China has a tariff or not, we end up with a small gain. What's the optimal outcome for China? The optimal outcome for China is to have a tariff. Because regardless of whether the US has a tariff or not, they end up with a small gain in that product.
But that small gain, isn't the large loss of Turkey from that? Because if China also puts on a tariff, and the US has a small gain, also.
But we're looking at, so what we're doing though is, this is why I say it's a partial equilibrium analysis. We're looking at the aspects of the particular industry that we're putting the tariff on. Right? So when we put a tariff on imports from China, as the US, we get a small gain out of that. China gets a loss. There's no doubt about that. When China puts a tariff on, they get a gain from that. Yes, they impose a loss on us, but that's their action. Our action is still, we want the gain from our tariff. Right? No? Confused? Okay. So let me, yes? Okay, let me come back to that. Aha. That's exactly the point. Free international trade is not the best outcome for both countries. That's right. That's why I say it's a partial equilibrium analysis. If I don't take into consideration the response of the other party, then it's always in a country's best interest to impose, a large country's best interest to impose a tariff. Right? So if I'm only thinking about one industry, I can put on a tariff or not put on a tariff. If I put on an optimal tariff, I get a net increase in economic welfare. That's all I'm looking at is that one particular industry. That's what I should be doing. Every large country would have exactly the same opportunity. The opportunity to improve their welfare, economic welfare, in that industry by looking at or by imposing an optimal tariff. Now, does that mean that you can't have retaliation by the other party? And the answer is no, it doesn't. But if you look at it from an individual, and remember, trade barriers are by individual products or individual industries. I think I mentioned it. The only country that I know that has a uniform tariff was Chile. So everybody, we've got so many damn tariffs on different kinds of products and different industries. That's got to be the way people are looking at it. So we got our tariffs, they've got their tariffs. Why do we put them on? It must be because we think that we're better off, or at least the political process has been perverted in a way that each country thinks they're better off with those tariffs. So if we think about it from a partial equilibrium perspective, this is what we actually ends up happening. Now notice that these large losses that are taking place here, we are taking into consideration what the other country is doing. But that's all looking at it from a single industry effect. Here we've got two industries going on. Now we know, and we can show what happens, if both countries actually do this, both countries end up with also having net losses, right, on the good that they are exporting. Right? Okay. So what we actually end up with then is a situation where, because policy is done on a partial equilibrium basis, this ends up being our Nash equilibrium, and we find that trade protection is very easy to justify as a way of improving a country's national economic welfare. So if that's the case, now what we need to do is figure out how do we overcome that. What we have seen, by the way, is exactly what was suggested. The free international trade does give us the highest level of national economic welfare. But when you have play policy games, it can be shown that that is not necessarily the outcome that will occur. So how do multilateral negotiations actually help out here? We have talked earlier that import competing producers are generally very well organized and can be very well politically connected and will lobby for some sort of trade protection. Consumers of a product, which receive most of the benefits from imports, are generally widely diffused, find it very difficult to organize either financially or politically, and therefore do not provide very effective opposition to trade barriers. So another way of trying to offset the power of import competing producers is to pull domestic exporters into the picture. Now, domestic exporters are not going to be able to do or say much about what's going to happen in the import